Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Who are you? How did you get here?
Hmm, That is a very broad question. My name is Christopher King. I assume by get here you mean why are you interviewing me? Presumably, you're interviewing me because I made 20XX. I am a designer in the small team video game development industry. I got here. Well, let's see, how far back do I want to go? I've known that I wanted to make video games pretty much my entire life, or at least make games of some kind. I went to school for computer science as an undergrad, figuring that I was going to make games someday using that skill set. And when I finally got to my late 20s after working for a telecom services company and a cybersecurity company as a programmer for a little while, I figured this is the only time in my life where I have both some money that I could afford to gamble with and not a spouse or kids or anything like that who'd be really upset or put out if I gambled all of that money and lost it. So I decided to try making video games with it, and we spent 4 years or so making and remaking 20XX, and then another year porting it to consoles, and everything has gone just lovely.
So, when did you first start making games?
Man, this is sort of a question of semantics here, I guess. I first started making games. I was making pen and paper RPG style things as a
I.
little boy when I was like 4 or 5. Obviously I was way too young
Mm.
to learn to program, but I could certainly write out, you know, steps and phases and systems and stuff like that. As far as my, like 5-year-old mind understood it on lots of sheets of paper. I'm pretty sure they're still buried in, one of my parents' attics somewhere. But I really first started making, computer games or video games or whatever would eventually become 20XX. Well, let's see. When did I start noodling around? There is a game, if you want to call it that. I don't know if it's currently purchasable. I think it's not. It's
Is
called
this.
Spacious. I don't know. Are you familiar with this? Have you ever heard about? Have I ever told you any of this stuff? Does
No, this
anybody
is
in
new to
2026
me.
community know about this? Oh man,
No, this is new.
this is not. It's not something I associate with Battery Staple. But this is sort of my prototype or proof of concept game, just to sort of like walk myself through the process from end to end, design a thing, maybe polish it a little bit, figure out storefront stuff a little, do a little bit of promotion, that kind of thing. Obviously, nowhere near the scale of 20XX, but it's a 3D platformer with god awful camera and pretty bad controls too, actually, and
Is
also bad visuals. It's mostly just bad across the board.
is that the VR game?
No, that's another one. That's called Rift Rush, which is actually just Spacious with a few different mechanics in VR. With Spacious, it's like a 9 level, semi narrative driven thing. Uh, it's a 3D platformer, and you collect some bits and you try not to die. But after doing that, it was really I was doing that part time as kind of like a side gig while working for a long time, for a couple of years on and off. I finally got to a point where I considered it done as far as I was concerned. I put it up on Desera back when Desera was still alive. I think it sold about 12 overall copies over the course of its lifespan. That engine actually went on to become the 20XX engine, albeit with a tremendous number of changes and improvements.
Really
Uh,
now?
yeah,
So,
yeah, they're the same code base, just worked on for a really long period of time. I'm sure I've said this before at least once, but the 20XX engine is actually a 3D engine. It just renders everything at the same depth plane.
I remember that.
Uh,
And
yeah,
that.
so I guess Spacious is when I really started making video games. So that would have been, let's see, if I started 20XX in 2013, I probably would have started noodling around with Spacious in like 2010, 2009, somewhere in there.
And where does Rift Rush fit into this puzzle?
We were fortunate enough to have one of the relatively early Oculus dev kits. Unfortunately, 3D art and the talent necessary to make all of that go and look good was way beyond my skill set at the time. It's not the kind of thing I really knew how to do. So Rift Rush was a very simple first-person platformer where the deal was that we solved the issue of, it's kind of an issue in VR when you first start getting into it, where you're not used to the idea that not only can you turn your perspective by turning your head, but you can also turn with like a thumbstick. You can turn the camera like you would in any other game where you weren't actually also looking through a headset. And we solved that problem by disabling turning with a controller and having all of the platforming and all of the action just be straight ahead of you at all times, so you never need to turn. And the graphics were relatively straightforward, so people didn't really feel simulator sick with it, which was kind of a big win for us. But it was a tiny project, and we basically finished the single mode. It actually, I don't know if we ever shipped this, but it actually had an online multiplayer mode as well. Super, super, super rudimentary, like not at all polished, but it worked
I
about
know.
as well as the early 20XX multiplayer builds worked, if we're being honest, which is decently, but not perfect. Yeah, so it was a project that we pursued very, very briefly back in, I don't know, it was whatever year the Oculus first got announced.
Then you move on to 20XX or Echoes of Eridu at the time, your
That's
passion
right.
project. How
Yeah.
long have you wanted to make the replayable Mega Man game?
Oh, for a long time. I think the desire to make replayable Mega Man or to experience replayable Mega Man goes back further than the desire to make it. I've just always wanted. I've never finished a really satisfying Mega Man title or similar experience, and been like, okay, I'm satisfied. I don't need any more. That's good. I've always wanted more of that.
And you can only play the classics games, and by classic I don't mean the classic series, just the all the X games and Zero games and all that in general so many times before they get stale.
Right. And it's not even a matter like you can certainly revisit them, every so often, but you couldn't play one of those games daily or weekly forever. I mean, I'm sure a couple of people do, like speedrunners certainly do, right?
Indeed, I was
But
actually trying a Nine Skull run earlier today. I
as far as
got
I know, there's only one person who's ever finished one.
he's done 10 skulls.
Oh, jeez, yeah, he's crazy, so incredibly talented. Like I know that I made this thing, and I'm supposed to be familiar with all of the various permutations and how everything can shake out. But there was one of those videos in like it was either a 9 or 10 skull run, right, where he gets to the twin astrals at I think they're level 7 or 8, like right at the end of his regular 8 set run, and I think he gets there with like 2 HP, and there's just this like it almost looks tool assisted the way he dodges everything, and it's absolutely crazy. And I think he gets hit once right toward the end and then finishes it and doesn't die. And it's I don't know, it's very intense to watch, and I know that it was very satisfying knowing that I had somehow made a thing that was still intense to watch for me. But I think we got away from what was the original question there?
Echoes of Eridu.
Oh, what made me want to make it? I've always wanted to have more of that stuff, but it wasn't until I figured, hey, this might be my shot to actually make games. I still think there's a market dearth of this kind of action platformer experience, and maybe I can make it.
Yes, and you used the first two games as sort of your practice before you took a serious attempt.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way of putting it. Neither of those projects are anywhere near as deep or as involved or as polished as 20XX ended up being. But they certainly still gave me a pretty good leg up on like the basics of, well, okay, if I'm going to make my own engine, how do I need to do that? What are the basics? What needs to get connected together? The pretty rudimentary multiplayer for Rift Rush also ended up becoming sort of the basic skeleton of 20XX's multiplayer eventually. So yeah, they gave me some good building blocks up front, so I wasn't completely starting fresh.
I noticed in your GDC talk you didn't explicitly name Mighty Number 9, but a lot of what you've done, I've noticed, mirrors lessons that honestly would have helped Mighty Number 9 out a lot. So,
Yeah, that's probably true. Sorry, go on.
so you created the Kickstarter, and then Mighty Number 9 comes along, and then
Yeah.
you announce your own Kickstarter, and from an outside perspective, it looks like you're just riding along the hype wave that Mighty Number 9 generated. Even if I read your timeline, even if you did start making it first, but who knows when Mighty Number 9 was first.
Yeah, you never know when it was conceived. The size of the project means it was probably conceived before ours, but obviously it wasn't public until we've been working on ours for a couple of months. Uh, Question one: is my GDC talk public?
It
Do you
is.
have vault access, or is it free to anybody?
It's free to anyone.
Oh man, I don't want to watch it. I hate the sound of my own recorded voice.
I, I,
Cannot stand it.
I know they sound so different.
Yeah, it's really jarring. Anyway, I'm sure that they had conceived their idea before we started work on 20XX at least. Uh, that was a tough day. We had started. We'd been basically been working on it for like 3 or 4 months at that point, and suddenly this is like the person recognized. Regardless of how true it is, the person recognized as the father of Mega Man puts together a Kickstarter for a spiritual successor. Um, I'm sure I've said this a bunch of times by now, and it's certainly in my postmortem, if nothing else. But I knew after I sort of got over the shock of like, oh, poop, this is a much larger fish than I want to contend with. Uh, I realized that we really were offering two fundamentally different things, especially with 20XX's sort of roguelite DNA being a core feature of it. We really were offering a very different experience than like a static set of handcrafted Mega
Even
Mans.
without the roguelike elements, Mighty Number 9 was aiming for more of a classic style Mega Man. You wanted from the get-go to make an X-style Mega Man, which is extremely different. I think that
For sure.
alone could have been a good enough distinction for most people.
Yeah, you're probably right about that. I think I think there are a number of fans that they're obviously like, you're absolutely correct that the handling and the experience of the NES classic Mega Man games and the later 9 and 10 and now 11 feel very different than the entire X series, if for absolutely no other reason than just because of the existence of an omnipresent dash, right?
And the wall climb.
Yeah, the speed and the mobility of the X games just make them really stand out. And there are a ton of fans, just like you, who would certainly make that distinction and see, oh, well, one of these is X inspired and one of these is Mega Man inspired, and they're probably going to be different experiences. But I think there are a tremendous amount of fans who would not see that difference. So it's certainly nice that we had the roguelike distinctor too.
Indeed. So then, your Kickstarter. It was very close.
Gosh, yeah, it was.
You just barely made the funding by about 500 more than the minimum.
Mm-hmm.
And
I don't know if I've shared this at some point, but there was one backer who, in the middle of the campaign, had thrown in $500 or so. And then when we had crested that 20,000 goal in like the last day or so, at one point he decreased his pledge from 500 to 100, and it dropped us to like right there on the edge. I don't think it dropped us beneath 20K. I think internally he had said, okay, they beat their goal. This is going to be funded. Now I can decrease my pledge. But like if anybody else had done that at the same time, we would have been in a very difficult spot.
you didn't reach any of your stretch goals. But even then, you still made them to an extent. Your 30,000 stretch goal was 2 bonus characters, and though we didn't get Jam and Blitz, we did eventually get Hawk and Draco. And your 50,000 stretch goal was 33% more content. I think you added way more than that.
Yeah, you're making me go back and look at all of my stretch goals. 20XX became so much more than its original scope called for. That none of those stretch goals really ended up being. Yeah, geez, what did I even? It's kind of funny. So let's see. We got the 2 bonus characters, which we obviously did. 33% more content. Yeah, we ended up with a lot more than we intended to there.
Co-op matchmaking at 75,000.
Yeah, we did that too. And then at 100,000, it just says the greatest mystery. I don't even know that I remember what this reward was.
You don't? I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah. That, or I'll just have to keep it private forever because it is the greatest mystery, and we never actually unlock that. That's what I'm gonna.
The greatest mystery, even from the creator.
Literally the greatest mystery. Nobody knows.
So then, afterwards, you decided to release your game in early access instead of finishing it and then doing it once from the get-go. Why was that?
That was honestly the best decision we ever made with the game. So today, people are calling this process open development, right? Where you sort of crowdsource feedback from your fans. You update very frequently. You have a game that they can play very early, and you take their feedback very seriously. We've been doing that from the moment we launched in early access. Obviously, the game looked very different when it was Echoes of Eridu, and it looked very different when it first came out onto Steam a couple of days before Thanksgiving 2014. And while the art style wasn't super appealing back then, the people who did latch on, we've always kind of delivered on that sort of Mega Man X feeling promise, even when it was pretty rough around the edges. So the people who did latch on ended up being really strong supporters. Like we've had a number of supporters that are still around with the community today, that have been around since that first week of early access. And the feedback and support that we've had from those fans, and honestly, like you, has been such a crazy important part of development for us for the entire dev cycle, that I couldn't imagine doing it any other way. And I'd love to continue to do that kind of thing going forward with anything else I end up working on.
You would. So, I was. Hang on. So, you. I'm sorry. Let me just.
No, you're good. We can edit this out.
20XX is a roguelike. It's replayable by its nature. That, I think, had a very massive factor contributed to the player attention with regards to
sure.
testing. And
Yep.
you touch upon it once in your post-mortem, but you never mention it again, and I think it's actually a really important detail. I played the game while it was in early access, I played it every day because it was different. I don't imagine I would have played it that many times if it was a single experience.
Yeah, that's almost certainly true. Any kind of game that can throw a unique situation at you after you've already played it a whole lot, or a relatively unique feeling situation, really goes a long way toward getting you interested in playing the machine over and over, or the game. Like I've even recently, I didn't really attach too much to Chasm when it first came out, but I've kind of found myself noodling around with its daily challenges now again, because it's taken all of the parts about the game I really enjoy, and then just sort of compacted them into a much more dense feeling experience, positively dense. All the good parts I want are right next to each other instead of being spread out by stretches of backtracking and exploration and stuff like that. I think games that are successful in doing this kind of thing are really appealing for exactly that reason. You can just come back and play them over and over and over.
Do you think early access could help single playthrough games?
They probably can. It's obviously very different. So like a lot of why this worked for us was because we can have a number of fans who will come back and play the game every week or every day or every couple of weeks or whatever like that. Early access for a single player title can still help, but you need a much larger sales base to get the same amount of player attention. Like let's say, for sake of argument, if I have a number of fans coming back once a week, and that's my play experience for 20XX versus a number of fans who will play it once or twice over the course of development, because it doesn't change that much from run to run other than what the developers have actually done to improve the game since then. You need a lot more people to get the right amount of feedback, and even then the feedback you're getting isn't going to be quite as, I don't know, researched isn't the right word, but well understood, informed, I guess is the word I'm looking for. For example, when you make a comment about 20XX, you personally, you do so with a pretty good depth of knowledge about the game that you're talking about. Obviously, you don't fully understand everything from a mechanical level, in the code base, because how could you? But you understand it just about as well as anybody who didn't literally make the game themselves could, right? Whereas if you have 10 times that much feedback, but from players who are only playing your game once or twice, you'll still get an awful lot of feedback and a lot of first experience kind of feedback, which is still incredibly valuable. But it won't be anywhere near as well informed as the feedback of somebody who's played the game a lot.
1,200 hours worth.
It's a lot of hours.
And you have even more than me.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yes.
But the other factor is you also update it every other week.
That's a big part of it for us, yeah.
I think even without the roguelike elements keeping the player retention, player constantly playing, they would have come back every other week.
Yeah, I think a lot of them still would. You're right. The update clock was a big part of it. I know you, since you saw the talk, that me mentioning putting the clock on your game's main menu screen is it's literally the first bullet point of the talk, and it's if you do anything from this presentation at all, go do this, because it's it's a big deal. People it's two in one, right? Or two things in one. The first is that players know exactly when they can come back and see something new, and on the other our side of it, players know that as soon as they see a couple of those updates go off as promised, they know that the early access title isn't abandoned. In the early days of early access and Kickstarter, there were a number of sort of high-profile games that either failed to deliver on their Kickstarter promises or went into early access, made a bunch of money, and then kind of either slowed down or abandoned development. So having that 2-week timer immediately tells somebody, like they can go and just look at the patch notes themselves if they're new to the game, right? And they can see that we've updated it, every 2 weeks for however long we've been in business. And they can see, hey, this isn't an abandoned early access title, so it serves both of those purposes.
So I think in a single player game, if devs are able to keep to as strict a schedule as you are, they would be able to keep their players all constantly playing, at least like in your case, once every 2 weeks to get feedback.
You'd hope so. I don't think you'd get quite that attach rate from a non-replayable or relatively static experience, unless it was a really good one. So I think it depends on the kind of static experience, right? So you could argue that Mega Man 11 is a static experience, but that's still very fun to play through after you've played it through once. Whereas if your game is very heavily narrative driven, if most of the punch of your game is in the emotional impact of the story, most of your players are not going to come back every 2 weeks, almost no matter what.
That was good. I actually played through A Link Between Worlds 4 times in succession the first time I bought it after I beat it. It was so good.
Yeah, that's fair. There have been a number of games where I've done that too.
So that was my next point that you touched upon. Story-driven games. Do you think they are any fit for early access?
For the most part, I don't. Early access doesn't have to be used in the sort of all-encompassing, full embrace way that we did. We really, really leaned into early access and said, we're going to make this game along with our community. This is going to be great. A number of... Do you know Zachtronics, the company? They make a bunch of puzzle games, TIS 100, Shenzhen.io, stuff like that. They made Exapunks and Magnum or Opus Magnum was them too. Whole bunch of puzzle games, but their early access strategy is that they'll go into early access about 2 months before full launch, and they really just use early access as a hey, let's get some bugs out of the way before we say this is 1.0.
So it's basically a complete version just with a few bugs, and then they patch those out?
That's right. They basically say, we think this is finished, but let's iron out some, whatever balance issues might pop up immediately or whatever user pain points get in the way of enjoying the full experience. We'll get those out of the way, and then we'll go ahead and say it's 1.0.
But you had early access right from the start, and like you said...
we were in early access for 2 years and 8 months, I think, right? So it would be November... I don't remember what day in November 2014 we launched in early access, but it was between then and August 16th, 2017 was 1.0. So a long time. Yeah, I guess it's 2 years and 9 months. Jeez,
a long time in early access.
It was a long time. We basically built the game from the ground up multiple times, right? Like if you look at the art of the game as it came out on early access the first time around, and then look at the finished game art, almost no asset actually survives. We basically remade every single one, and of course we iterated on so many design and mechanical elements of the game too.
Speaking of art, this is a side question, but sure. I was looking back through old footage and I noticed the art style, well, not the art, just the color in general, there's a lot less green everywhere. Like I remember in the beta there was at one point everything was green. Mortars, mace knights, flaps, there was a lot of green. It was pretty much overused, and now it's very rare on enemies.
I don't know that was a deliberate choice of ours. We might have pivoted away from, green for enemy design purposes. Thinking about it, there aren't really very many green projectiles, are there? Yeah, I guess we kind of do shift away from it. And I can't say it's just because green is like the color of health pickups or anything. It definitely wasn't a deliberate choice to disambiguate those, I don't think. but it certainly seems to have worked out that way. I can't say that was intentional, honestly.
I see. So I'm gonna backtrack just a second.
Yeah, yeah.
You did say that not all players would come back on bi-weekly updates. While I was doing 19XX, Sour was like, "You don't have to play every single version. You
It's a
just..."
lot of versions.
He just points out like these are minor. You can skip these, and then so yeah,
Yeah, it's true. If you look back at the, the patch notes are all on Steam and, will be basically forever, right? So you can just look back for the really impactful patches and just play those.
yeah. So I guess you have a point that the update clock alone wouldn't have been enough. It also depends on the content of your patches.
Right. Yeah, not every patch can be a huge winner.
So moving on, communication is extremely important to you. Everything, it seems. Why is that?
Why is communication important to me?
Yes.
I mean, communication is certainly, depending on exactly what, communication channel we're talking about. Communication
In
is,
regards to in regards to the development of what you want to do and what you can't do yet, and
oh, sure. I just think being open and honest with your fans is a huge part of getting them, it's respecting their time and their interest in your project, right? You could certainly make the business case too that being open and honest with your fans helps them trust you and makes them more likely to give you good feedback and sort of believe in you when things don't go exactly the way you intended them to. I'm very particular about my communication style with our games fans specifically because there's always a specific way that I want to message something. Like when I know that there's something that people need to be told about our game or our design process or a mistake we've made, there's always a very particular way I intend to put it. It's just the way that it sounds right to me, the way that that message sounds genuine. I always want fans to know, if there's something fantastic that's going to happen soon, I want them to know about it as soon as I'm positive it will happen. But especially in early access, if we knew that there was either a bug that we were working on, or a crash that we were working on patching out, or anything like that, I'd want to make sure that people knew that we were working on it and that it was our top priority as soon as we were, able to promise that sort of thing, right? Like, I know this is a really like circuitous and rambling answer to this question, but keeping fans as aware of what's going on in my head regarding the game as possible ends up with them feeling closer to the process, being closer to the process, literally, because I'm sharing all of that with them, and having a better, they themselves will have a better frame of reference for talking about the development of the game, both with me when they're offering feedback on stuff that I've done, and with the rest of the community. If I say my design goals for this feature are A, B, and C, like this is where I'm coming from, it also helps fans. Like if you have that frame of reference, if you know that I want A, B, and C out of this feature, if the thing that you really care about is D, it's something that's not on my list, you can make sure that, I'm aware of that. If there are a whole bunch of fans that have a specific, need for a feature that I'm not currently planning on, it
like
gives them
auto
the
charge.
like auto charge. That's another topic of discussion. Like auto charge. Obviously, I'm not going to agree with every single request that fans might have, but over the course of 20x's development, we implemented a tremendous number of those things, right? So it's really about to answer that question concisely, now that I've been rambling for several minutes, it's really about keeping the fans as well informed as possible about what's going on with the game's development, because it informs both, their experience and their conversations with and feedback about the game.
And this really does make fans very happy. I think a large part of that is because the bar has been set so low. Most fans are used to just radio silence in terms of their favorite games.
Yeah, it's true. A lot of developers, so this is the only reason this worked this way is because we've been a relatively small game all along. If you suddenly multiply 20xx's fan base by 10, there are certainly periods there where I just don't have time for the same level of of responsiveness and personal interaction with the community that I've had over the course of 20xx's development. So it's a thing that really doesn't necessarily scale super well. Thankfully, since we have the Discord server, since we have the Steam community, it's not like the amount of work I have to do to interact with the community doesn't scale linearly with the number of people playing. Because forums and public spaces really amplify my voice and let me reach multiple people at once, a lot of the people who have a certain issue already have their issue covered by something else that's been spoken about there. So even though adding that player might add that piece of feedback, if that feedback has already been addressed, I probably don't have to do anything with it, which is nice.
You mentioned this in your talk as well, that
I did. Yeah, it was a big part of it because I made some mistakes along these
the
fronts.
email.
Yeah, that support email. I still don't know how I get those.
Did you really get a call at 3 a.m.?
That part might be a bit of an embellishment. I have received all sorts of 3 a.m. phone calls, but not from anybody about support on 20xx. Actually, that's not entirely true, but not a random fan. Somebody who had my number for another reason and didn't realize what time it was in my time zone.
So, I'd like to take the focus to other indie games. Why do you think they keep their players in the dark?
Well, I don't think it's, I guess let's go through let's sort of blow that issue up and look at every possible avenue there, right? So you have titles where they deliberately do not tell their players what they are working on, and a lot of people will do that because of one of two reasons. They either don't want to spend the time communicating, because it is a very real cost. You've seen my talk. You know that I spent a solid 8 hours a week for pretty much all of early access interacting with our fans. That's a huge time cost, especially because I'm, also the designer and tech guy and engine person and all of that stuff. It's obviously a huge cost, and a lot of developers just won't want to pay it. If you don't think that the communication is as important to you as I think it is to 20xx, maybe you don't think that it's worth that massive cost, right? And then I'm sure you have at least a couple of developers who want to try and keep things under wraps and keep them surprising as long as possible. Instead of saying, here's our roadmap, here's what's coming, here's what we're working on, just have it be a surprise to try and, oh, wow, hype, surprise, I guess. There have been a number of titles that have succeeded doing that kind of thing. And a lot of developers, a lot of designers, work best without, so I'm not the kind of designer who walks into an empty room and, walks out of there by myself with a masterpiece. The reason 20xx ended up being great is because instead of being able to walk into a room and create something wonderful all by myself, what I was really good at is going through the feedback and suggestions of a large number of players and saying, yeah, I think that's a good fit, or no, I don't think that's a good fit. If you as a designer are able to sort of make something wonderful entirely by yourself, maybe you don't want that open feedback, maybe you don't need it, and so you don't want to spend the time communicating with your fans like that. Oh, that was the sound of a controller hitting the floor. So it's, to sum up, developers who don't have this level of communication with their fans are doing it either because they don't want to spend the time, or because they don't want the feedback, or both, or because they want to keep things surprising.
Or they already know exactly what they're doing.
Yeah. Actually, I had the fortune of meeting, Lord, what is his name? Matthew Davis, one of the Subset Games guys at GDC from Into the Breach and FTL.
Oh man,
FTL and they don't do. It's a fantastic game. Their games are incredible. Into the Breach is basically a master class on UI and UX all by itself, right? And we talked about this a little bit actually, and his take was basically that he doesn't do a lot of community interaction specifically because he's a very good feel for exactly the way he wants to do his work and how he wants to design his games. And he doesn't really, that's not really his style, the whole open development deal. And obviously it has worked incredibly well for him. The dude is a fantastic designer. So, it can work either way.
So let's talk about what you want to do. How do you determine when to say no to popular requests or fair or other requests for reasons such as preserving the creative vision of the game?
I mean, so it's this goes back to the GDC talk as well, right? Like I'm gauging everything on a combination of fit for the game and the creative vision, fit for the community, the impact of the change, and the scope of the change, right? How long it's going to take me to actually do it, and pretty much everything is judged exactly like that. If something goes very strongly against my creative vision, it doesn't necessarily matter how big of a community thing it is. And there have been a couple of cases like that, very, very few, but a couple. And sometimes the community might really want something that's just out of scope. It would just take way too long to have a high enough impact to be worth doing. Or given the time frames available to us, it might just be literally impossible to do, no matter how amazing it would be. So everything is sort of judged along those criteria, and the ones that fit get done, and the ones that don't.
And what if it's in scope, like say auto charge?
You keep bringing up auto charge. This seems a lot less like an interview for a specific purpose, and a lot more like a when are you implementing auto charge?
It's not. That's just the first thing that came to my mind.
Sure. It's always been very against the creative vision, but I'm trying to think of what I can say here. There will be a point in the future at which you can play something I have made where you don't have this complaint. I'm not going to be any more specific than that. But there you go.
Okay. But that didn't really answer the question of how do you say no for preserving your creative vision if it's in scope?
Well, it's easy. We just, this is not in line with the game's creative vision. You've seen exactly how I handle that issue myself, right?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. So I think you may intrinsically know the answer to that. I'm trying to think of how to put it into words. As long as you are very open with the fan base about your reasoning behind something like that, which for me is just, this isn't with the creative vision of the game. We really want that buttonhole to be deliberate. Not every fan is going to agree, but most fans will understand. And they will much appreciate taking the time to say, hey, this really isn't the way that we're thinking about this, instead of just completely ignoring it and letting it go unanswered.
So let's talk about when you can't possibly follow your creative vision. What were some things you really wanted to do, but you absolutely knew your players would hate it completely?
I don't know that we had any of those. Are there some that you know of that I'm not thinking of?
No, I was hoping you had some.
Yeah, no, I don't really think there's anything we, So you certainly have to take the community under consideration when you change things that might be like beloved game components, right? And I'm sure there are theoretical cases of something you really want to do being not feasible because of the community backlash, but I don't think there's anything we never tried to do because of that. Honestly, the closest thing was when I proposed having sort of monthly, week-long, janky rule set events to try and focus the community and give them something to come back to after the game's release.
Oh yeah, I remember that. We shot it down.
You did, and so I never did it. So actually, there you go. My relatively small group of trusted fans of the game said, we don't really think this is all that interesting. And so I didn't do it. So there's one.
So that small group was your Super Friends group.
That's right.
Why did you make it?
Because it was really important to me to get, even an earlier version of early access feedback on a number of things. It's very much a two-way street. People in our Super Friends group get sort of a slightly elevated level of influence over the game because they have access to stuff that I'm working on before it goes out to everybody else. And of course, they get to see and talk about that stuff early, and I think a lot of fans really enjoy that. And for me, obviously, I get that first line of defense before something goes live about the quality level of something. You guys know that I redid a whole lot of stuff with the games, levels 9 and 10 before they went live that Super Friends had access to for a couple of months because we really were pushing, work in progress stuff instead of instead of saying this is a draft, we basically said this is kind of what we're working on, what's working here and what's not. If I recall, I think the idea of having level 9 be super platformer heavy and level 10 be super combat heavy,
It
I think that
was.
was even a super fan idea.
It was Cyrek's idea.
That's right. Yeah.
So
So
that
we got a lot of value out of that, and I think that the people who participated in that process, kind of felt like they got to be part of this cool, semi-exclusive club where they got to see and influence this while it was being developed, instead of helping guide it after it was developed.
So that's what I like about this. I can just look at certain portions and say, hey, I did that, or I'm partly responsible for that, or know the guy who did that.
Bingo. And that's cool, right? Like, that's a thing that folks who are involved in that and are interested in that really enjoy. So it really is, I'm super happy that it works out this way, that it really is a two-way street, because I'm obviously getting a lot of value out of being able to show a smaller group of players this stuff while I'm working on it. And you guys get a lot of value and are getting to see it early and influence its development.
I think the general use of Super Friends, the use case, changed a bit over the course. First, it was just testing as a last line of defense and early testing, but then we got stuff like we tested whole levels, new characters, and all that.
Oh, yeah. So the intent of Super Friends was always to do this. Even when we created it and was where we were really just using it for, sort of less fantastic features than full levels and DLC characters and stuff like that. We always knew that sometime down the road we were going to want that kind of capability, so we figured we would build that community well in advance of when we needed it.
So a super small, kind of like closed beta.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. We call them early access or Super Friends.
So it used to be open admissions, and then you waited 2 months, and then you would have to email you to get in because the automated system didn't work. Why did you close admissions to Super Friends?
So the point of Super Friends has always been to basically have exactly the amount of feedback we need. It's a tough spot to land on, right? Like, what exactly is the right amount of space you need, or the right amount of feedback you need? Sorry. But when we felt like we had enough participation in each of our Super Friends patches to get most of the stuff before it hit live, that was when we kind of felt like we had sufficient feedback there. And so we eventually closed it off. We've had a few people over the time, but not a whole lot.
It mainly consists of your veterans right now.
Yeah, that's largely true. Which, it makes a lot of sense. The game is not in super active development right this moment. So it makes sense that we're not getting a whole lot of new Super Friends right now.
So I'd like to talk about your community now.
Sure.
Your veterans. Do you place greater importance on their feedback versus newer players?
Sort of. It depends on what it depends on what we're talking about, right? If I obviously care much more about a veteran's feedback when it comes to game balance issues and things that, I'm a lot more likely to trust if the person speaking has a lot of like in-depth knowledge about the game. For example, if somebody who's new to the game comes in and says, Splinter Frost is super OP, why would I ever use any other weapon? That gives me a piece of information, which is that it appears that way to some players. So like if a lot of new players said that, maybe I have a messaging issue or something, like maybe the weapon feels more powerful than it is, or, maybe it's just too easy to use relative to other stuff. But when somebody who's played for several hundred or 1,200 hours says, hey, I think this weapon is kind of useless, or, this weapon is super powerful, I'm a lot more likely to listen without a much bigger audience saying the same thing, if that makes sense. On the other hand, if new players are talking about something about the new player experience, I care much more about a new player's experience about the game's tutorial necessarily than I care about a several hundred hour veteran's opinion about the tutorial, because they're not looking at it through the lens that I care about. Like, what I want in a tutorial is for somebody who's never played the game before to be onboarded relatively smoothly, to understand the game's mechanics and have a general feel for what's going on. And someone who already has played the game for 1,000 hours isn't likely to give an unbiased view of that for like a tutorial. So there are certainly arenas in which I will consider each of those two players' feedbacks to be more important in that arena.
I see. In your talk, you mentioned favorite players. Are they different from veteran players?
I'm not going to answer that question.
They're, but
Skip.
okay then. I don't know why that was.
Just a potentially contentious question. You never know.
So let's talk about the player base at large.
Sure.
We've had a lot of discussions before we bring them to you. And then after you joined the Discord, you could actually see the discussions happening.
Yeah.
What was your general process in regards to balancing opposing viewpoints regarding a specific issue?
When I consider multiple segments of the community that have opposing views on something, a lot of the time I'm trying to ask what is the actual pain point each of these members might have. About half the time there's a pretty decent way to find a happy medium between the two, or a solution that makes both groups happy, instead of just a binary, do the thing group A is suggesting or do the thing group B is suggesting. Other than that, though, when there are opposing viewpoints where there has to be, a binary decision made between the two of them, I'm really just thinking of which one is better for the game. And just like it's not, in those cases, it's not handled that much differently than, single-sided feedback, when there's just one group of people saying, hello, I would like, feature A or change B. I'm sitting there thinking, is this a good fit for the game or not? And if it is, sure, here's what we're planning on doing. And if it's not, sorry, but for whatever reason, be it scope or be it fit, I don't think we're going to move forward this way. I don't handle them that much differently. I'm almost considering them as, if the community has two conflicting opinions about something, I'm almost considering them both as individual suggestions that I'm thinking about differently, or separately, I should say.
But what if they're completely opposite in regards to each other?
Then I'm going to tell that group, whichever side I think is the right path for the game. If in fact I think one side is the right path for the game, I'm going to say, I think we are going to go this way. I think this makes sense, and here's why. And to the other group, I'm going to explain why I feel the other way as best as possible. Which is exactly what I would do if they were two completely orthogonal suggestions, right? I never mean to, and I hope it's not interpreted as me like picking sides or choosing one half of an argument over the other. I'm just seeing one thing I think is a good fit for the game and another thing that I don't, and I'm going to treat them that way. Nothing is this. Another step back to my talk. Anytime I am making decision about what to do with a piece of fan feedback, I'm never considering the speakers, really. I'm considering the information itself. I'm considering the proposal. We've gotten lots of good suggestions over the course of 20xx's development from, individual fans with which I've never had an interaction and have no idea who they are. And I've gotten plenty of suggestions I haven't implemented from people that have been playing the game for months and years. It really has much less to do with the speaker and much more to do with the thing being said. And I think, for the most part, our fans are very understanding about that and know that when I don't implement something they want, it is never remotely like personal or anything like that. I'm only considering what's best for the game in my eyes.
Yes, I see. So, you did say feedback from new players you've never ever met? Is that what you said?
Met, interacted with, heard from, whatever like that.
I've actually been at times when I'm talking to someone in the Discord, I'm like, hey, that's a great idea! And then the next opportunity I get, I pass it on to you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that too, right? Not every player is going to be comfortable going from a public setting like a Discord to, either posting on the Steam community to get my attention or sending me an email or whatever like that. And so sometimes those kinds of feedback redirections become very important.
Yeah, you've sort of created a sort of unofficial community managers where like, okay, this is a good idea. I have a little more con- interactivity with the developer, so I'll use that to pass it on. Or, okay, I can't troubleshoot this issue you're having. Now we can ping the developer.
Yep, bingo. That kind of you guys who moderate the 20xx Discord and sort of serve as what's the word I'm looking for? You're really kind of community advocates more than moderators in a lot of cases. Obviously, you guys have moderator responsibilities too, and I'm sure you have spammers and trolls now and again that need to be banned and dealt with. But just as often, and this is true on the Steam community as well, our veteran players who take it on themselves to help out newer players with questions, and not newer players with questions, and sort of be that first line of, I think the developer has said this prior, or this is where this is true on your issue, and stuff like that. That's it's super valuable. It's kind of a triple win. I know that the people who offer those kinds of services really enjoy doing so, and obviously a community member who gets an answered question is a happy community member. And the fact that all of that happens without me having to interact personally with all of those fans is a huge deal for me, because there's no way I could keep up with that.
So, the Discord,
Yep.
why did you decide to join it? It effectively gave your community a direct line to reach you once you joined in the form of a mention.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I don't have to respond to a mention if I don't want to, right? And there's certainly there's no real pressure to respond to it. I do to most of them anyway, because for the most part, the community has been very good about mentioning me, relatively rarely. It's not like I get spammed or anything.
I have enforced that from day one.
And I really appreciate it. That's a huge part of it. Obviously, if I got spammed, I would just never respond to any of it unless I knew exactly who the mentioner was. And even then, I might say, hey, please don't mention me all the time. I joined the Discord mostly as an extension of my interactions with the community. Before I joined the Discord, I was really into our Steam community, right? I was very responsive there, and I was very responsive via email and such, and of course on Twitter. So it only felt like a natural extension of my communication strategy with the game's fans that I also be available there in some fashion or other.
The Discord was actually just using our limited. Before that you joined, we had limited avenues of communicating with you, so we would often discuss everything over great length, and then once we came to a unanimous agreement, we would...
Yeah, once you found consensus, you would reach out to me, yeah.
We would post it, and then the post would immediately get 4 or 5 people responding in support. This has happened more than once.
Yeah, I'm aware. I always sort of wondered if you guys, once I did join the Discord, if you guys ended up forming a second Discord or some other community that I was not part of, so you would have somewhere to discuss these things that I couldn't see it.
Oh no, for the most part, we weren't worried about you watching while we trashed your game or something.
Yeah, that's fair. It's never going to be taken personally. The feedback is always good.
So then you decided to make the Discord official. And us as mods, we were 100% ready to support you in anything you wanted, new channels you wanted. If you want the Discord, it's yours. If you want to make it official, but why did you decide to ask to make the community Discord official as opposed to making your own?
I just didn't want to fragment the community. So my goal was to have a Discord community where I could point players who, saw the link in game or saw the link elsewhere and wanted to, participate in an official, battery staple sanctioned 20xx community. And I didn't want to fragment that. Like, the last thing I'd want to do is make my own and then, compete for attention with you guys. Like, that doesn't make any sense. I certainly wouldn't want to do that. And it was never really something we considered doing. If you guys, for whatever reason, did not want to pass ownership to me so that I could verify the server and point people to it, I probably just would have abandoned it. I don't really know. I can't say with 100% confidence that that's what I would have done. but I never really considered like making a separate server and trying to drive people to it because it would just sort of be, I don't know, it would have been pretty anti you guys at that point, and I'm certainly not interested in that.
So we're about wrapping up, but I have just a few more questions.
Sure, yeah. Oh
You,
wow, it's already 3. That was fast.
I know. So you made the test branch shortly after 1.0,
Yep.
and updates started going there instead of Super Friends. Why was that?
So Super Friends is really more for stuff that is a work in progress or stuff that is early enough that I'm not comfortable with it being seen by the greater community. Whereas test branch stuff is stuff that is, mostly done. It might have a few bugs with it, but the designs are the way I want them. Like you can be relatively sure that if I ever did something like build another character or build more level content or anything like that, all of that would certainly go to Super Friends first. All the test branch stuff has been, much, much, much lighter stuff. Not really massively
Options,
earth-shattering
settings.
changes. Yeah, stuff like options, settings, the static clicklets changes in there, stuff like that. Engine changes, stuff that I just wouldn't, I wouldn't feel necessarily even comfortable showing to Super Friends because part of the Super Friends pact, if you ask me, is that sort of the implicit agreement is that everything that I put there, if I post a patch to Super Friends, with maybe rare exception, I'm sure that if we went back and looked at every single Super Friends patch I ever posted, I'm sure one of them goes against this. But in general, my goal is to make sure that everything I'm posting there is exciting to see early. Like if it's, it's cool content to get to see before the general public, and stuff like options changes just doesn't fit that bill.
But your super friends are also your most dedicated fans. They would crave even the smallest update.
That's probably true, but I still don't want to use them for that purpose.
So instead, they go to the test branch.
That's right.
You mentioned in your talk that you can't really control what gets out, that because your super friends aren't employees and they're not under NDA.
Right.
But I think for the most part, we actually tried our best when you told us, don't tell anyone about this thing, so we kept it under wraps.
Yeah, you guys were absolutely outstanding about it. To the best of my knowledge, the overall public had, no real whiff of levels 9 and 10 before we hit 1.0, which was, absolutely outstanding. Like I was amazed that it went that well, and I was super proud that we had sort of cultivated a community that was, willing to trust itself like that.
We never even mentioned the existence of a level 10 after level 9. I just
That's
said
right. Oh,
the final levels.
Right. Yeah, that was super satisfying when people were like, "What? There's 10? What?"
And then you spoiled it yourself in the Discord at one point.
I did, yeah.
So yeah, I don't think it would be fair to expect every closed beta to be this secretive, but this one certainly was.
Yeah, it worked wonderfully. If the size of that community were also much larger, the chance of something getting out also goes way up. And it's kind of, imagine that we are a much, much, much larger scope game. There have certainly been plenty of games that have sold, more than 10 times as many copies as 20XX has. That would obviously be a large number of units, but a lot of games have done this. Games with that much potential press appeal also make people more likely to try and spill the beans. Like the more popular something is and the more well known it is, the more juicy that kind of information becomes, and the more likely it is that somebody tells the wrong person and everything becomes public too early.
That's fair. 20XX has been rather niche for the most part, if you don't mind me saying.
Oh no, that's fine. We target a pretty specific style of play. We're incredibly proud of what we've managed to accomplish in that relatively niche spot, and we're really happy with that. That's not at all insulting for us.
And you are right that the The size of Super Friends played a factor. I think there's like 30 people in the Discord with the Super Friends role, and then I went through all of them and like, okay, only 12 of these I know for a fact are actually going to participate the next time there's an update.
Right.
Actually, 10, two left.
Yeah, I've seen some of that, and it's pretty natural, right? Members aren't necessarily going to stay with the game indefinitely, especially as it goes, as it finishes early access and becomes a 1.0 thing. Uh, I wish that. Well, I don't really wish that anything. I think that's very natural, and it doesn't bother me in the slightest. It's obviously like a little sad to see, but it's not at all unexpected.
Your advice to other developers at the GDC talk was that their own super friends only tell them what they need to know. But I think when I was hearing you say that, I think for the most part you've told us more than we needed to know in the past.
That's probably true. Do you have an example of that?
Uh, Shipping the consoles without remapping?
Consoles without remapping. What aspect of that was more than you needed to know?
I mean, you told us that it was bad advice, and then when someone mentioned it in public, you asked us not to mention it in public.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Um, I think it was specifically that. Yeah, you're right. That probably was a little bit of overshare. Specifically, that I was trying to say. So, when somebody gives you advice, what you do with that piece of advice is then on you, right? If somebody gives you a piece of advice and you follow it and it doesn't end up well, it doesn't mean it's your advice giver's fault. It means that you took bad advice. And it's kind of, if you hear something, if my advice to you is to go jump off a bridge and then you do it, it is hardly my fault as somebody advising you to do that. Maybe the fault there is dependent on how obviously bad the advice is. In my case, so if I give you advice on something that's relatively cryptic, right, and you have no way of telling whether or not it's bad advice, but you trust me, it might not be my fault necessarily if I gave you advice that I really believed in, but it's probably not your fault either, right? In the case of controller rebinding, not having rebinds in hindsight, like that's obviously bad advice, and I should have known better. So when I told you guys, I followed, some advice that I probably shouldn't have. It's the equivalent of somebody telling me to jump off a bridge and me doing it. It's not that person's fault. It's absolutely my fault. And I was trying to sort of explain why I had done what I had done, not excuse it, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
Like I knew that I had made a mistake, and I was trying to say, hey, this is how I got here, not saying, well, it's not my fault because I got advice to do this. Like it was still absolutely my fault. But when the messaging outside of that group of super friends came, oh, he followed some bad advice from some other developer. Like I didn't like that messaging specifically because it sort of sounded like I was trying to make it sound like it wasn't my fault at that point when I really knew it was my fault.
Which ties back into you being super particular about your messaging.
Bingo. Yeah. Well said.
There's another thing, though, that your super friends, they're they are very loyal. I don't think many people know about the certain thing you leaked in the test branch that one time.
There may or may not be something that I may or may not have leaked in a test branch that may or may not have existed at a point that may or may not be in time.
We both know what you're talking about.
Sure, presumably.
I don't want to say it because this interview is recorded, but we both know what we're talking about.
Yeah, sure. I will neither confirm nor deny whatever the thing that you may or may not be talking about is.
But we've kept it secret.
Well, I appreciate that. Whether or not it exists.
So, a lot of what you did, a lot of your advice in the GDC talk, it's pretty much like taken out of context without knowing you're the developer of 20XX, just someone telling the advice. And then if someone told me it's related to Mighty Number 9, I would believe it.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it. Like, I think a lot of your lessons that you learned from early access, you've employed from I think they're failings of Mighty Number Nine to an extent.
We didn't. These lessons didn't really come from Mighty Number Nine. There's certainly things that if they had adhered to the kinds of things that we talk about in the talk, they certainly would have had a more positive community relationship. Like I think that's just true. But we didn't just study their failures exclusively and say we're going to do the opposite of those things. I think that's, even though it might be difficult to believe, it's really more of a coincidence than it looks like. These were the things that sort of led to us being able to have this, genuine open relationship with our fans, and we ended up really trading on that as a company. Like I'm very serious when I say that I think our community relationship is really a source of competitive advantage for Battery Staple, because a lot of companies either can't or won't have this sort of relationship with their community. Uh,
You've
and
built a
it's
lot of goodwill, and you're
that was yeah, I'm super proud of what we've been able to do. Sorry, go ahead.
and you're super determined to keep it that high. Like
Yeah,
you,
it's go ahead.
you want your players to be happy, and you'll go to great lengths to ensure that. I, I, it's left a positive impression. I think that if you if you're making any future game down the line and it's in early access, and I'm like, hey, I know him. I've
Right.
so I
That's
can
certainly
just
the hope. Kind of building. It's not. It's not intentionally. This is how I'm going to build myself, or as like a reputation as a developer. It really is first and foremost. If I were in that player's shoes, what would I want from the person who is making this game that I love? It's very conveniently ended up as people who've played this game. If they ever see a future title of mine on early access, they'll be able to say, "Oh, I remember that. That was a really positive experience. I want to get in on that." But it's really just been about the individual player's experience as far as that's possible. Obviously, right? Like we've had a number of players that will have individual one-off requests that are just they're wildly out of scope, and I just have to say, look, I'm sorry. This is just not something that we're all that likely to do. I'm sorry if this ends up ruining your experience. And usually when those kinds of things happen, I'll just say, if you're past your 2 weeks or your 2 hours or whatever on Steam, just let me know and I'll just PayPal you $15. I will offer you a personal refund. And I think that's happened like 3 times over the course of development. And the only reason it's possible is because the relative volume is low. Like the number of people who are
you only
really,
earn
really
seventy
upset about
percent
something.
of the sale.
Yeah, sure, whatever. I can afford the 450 or whatever the 30% is that I'm refunding that I don't get back. Yeah, you're right. When I refund somebody over PayPal or something, I am losing $4.50 if they bought the game at full price. And whatever, that's fine. I don't mind. Again, because it's happened like 3 times total. Obviously, if there were thousands of users for whom this were the case, this would be an incredibly expensive endeavor. But what's important to me is that somebody who buys my game is happy. And if they're not happy, that they just refund it, and that's fine.
Hang on, I forgot what I was going to say. I'm sorry.
No problem.
So I think your own efforts in early access for me personally, at first I guess I would have been like, why would I buy an unfinished game?
Yeah.
Then I like, okay, there's some. Then after my experience with 20XX, okay, there's some devs who really do care about listening to their community. I might buy some more early access games.
Right. Yeah, I think we've been a really good example of how early access can be a strength for a game's development instead of being, it's exactly like you're saying. Instead of, hey, I'm going to buy into this unfinished thing that I could, just as easily wait until it hits 1.0 and buy it then. Adding this incentive to get in on early access, specifically that, you can see the game sort of change in almost real time and have influence on the game's development and have this back and forth with, the real live human who is making this thing. Is a big appeal, and there's certainly there are a handful of games who do this kind of thing. Obviously, they are not the majority, but we're certainly not the only ones doing it. But yeah, building an incentive for people to actually
But
get
it's
into the
enough to
development
no
thing.
longer say all early access games are awful.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a gambit. It's just like Kickstarter campaigns. Some of them are outstanding and go above and beyond what they originally intended to do, and some of them take all your money and run for it. And that is exactly still the case with both early access too.
When End Cycle Versus first released on Steam and I saw it was in early access, I was like, okay, this looks cool, but I'm gonna wait a bit, see how the developer is listening and all that.
Yeah.
Never mind the fact that Sour wanted someone to play against, so he just bought me the game.
Yeah, sure.
But so then guess I got into the early access sooner than I would have. But
Right.
the developer there has also been very open about feedback.
That's great. That's wonderful. I think one of you was pointing this out in the Discord maybe a couple of months ago. I think the
Yeah,
creator of that game is one of my 20XX backers, if I'm
yeah.
not
I
mistaken.
was talking to him about 20XX at one point, and then we found out he backed 20XX, and he on the tier where you design a power, and he created Force Nova.
That's right. Yeah, if I recall, his suggestion didn't get implemented exactly the way it was there, but it ended up, I basically massaged it until it made sense as first it was Force Nova, and then I also took a piece of it as the Oxjack chest shield.
The Oxjack chest came way after
Yeah, it's
Force
obviously way
Nova.
later. Right. Yeah, no question.
So can you see yourself doing early access for future games?
Yeah, absolutely, no question, 100%. The only reason I wouldn't do it, at least given obviously caveat and preface by saying that everything is definitely subject to change, and I would never say never, but barring something pretty serious changing, the only reason I would skip early access is because somebody else, invested in my work, is very heavily suggesting that I not. Like, it's been such a colossal part of 20xx's development and success that I think I would be a fool not to use it again unless I had a very, very good reason.
How different do you think the direction 20XX would have taken if you launched it? If you, assuming, let's say you had all the funding you needed and you could make 20XX on your own, how
Yeah.
different would it have been?
Oh, it's impossible to tell, right? It would have been very different. And there's another question of what would my live support have been like? Like, would I have been? So I didn't know just how important that this kind of feedback was going to be to me until I got it. So going forward, let's say early access stopped existing, and for whatever reason I could not release a subsequent project on it, but I have all of the experience and knowledge and skill that I have now. I would just build the kind of thing I want in early access, in the form of a closed beta. I would find a way to get that feedback that I need, and I would find a way to sell a closed beta that people could jump in on and buy. Basically, instead of early access, I would make my own, more or less, because that early feedback.
Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Okay, you
Did you
broke
lose
up. Yeah, for a second you were saying something.
I was saying
Because that
that
early
open feedback is super important to me. If for some reason early access didn't exist, I would effectively fabricate my own, right? I would find a way to build a closed beta and to get that feedback over an extended period of time that I need for my fans.
So I think certain games really benefit from early access, especially roguelikes.
Yeah, I think that's very true, right?
You know that method to download old Steam versions of games?
Yeah.
I've actually decided when I ever get around to playing Dead Cells because, backlog, that I'm gonna download the first public version and then work my way up.
Oh my gosh, the game's changed quite a bit over the course of its development.
Not only does it extend the playability of the game more than early access, more than roguelike elements alone,
Yeah.
but it's also interesting to watch that development unfold.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a story that you get from sort of seeing a lot of different snapshots of a game's development that you just don't get if you come in right after 1.0. So I can certainly see the value in doing it that way. Obviously, it takes a tremendous amount of time, but sure.
Okay, I think that's all my questions.
Wonderful.
I just have 3 unrelated questions now.
Sure, go ahead.
You have a separate account on Steam that's your personal game account, and a separate one for Ping 20XX as battery staple games. Why is that?
Out of curiosity, do you know what my personal account is?
Yes?
Did I spoil that at some point, or did I just leave enough evidence that it was easy enough to figure out? I don't remember.
I sent you a friend request on it.
I didn't know why you had done that. I didn't know if you knew it was me. You did that after I had placed first or close to first on a couple of daily challenges in a row. And I assumed that you had just done it because you saw somebody else ranked highly on the daily leaderboard.
I just wanted to say I'm friends with the dev to my real life friends.
How did you know that that was my account? Out of curiosity.
Well, back before it was public,
Yeah.
back when it was public, you had an insane amount of hours in the game.
Oh, sure. Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense.
But
easy
that-
enough. Yeah,
but
I
that-
figured it probably wasn't.
But that
super
wasn't
well.
enough alone. Then one day I saw that your account, the one with, not your account, the account with the most amount of time I'd ever seen, had achievements well before anyone else. And I'm like,
That'll do it.
okay, this is definitely Chris's account.
There you go. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I have two accounts because I don't want to have one account. It's more or less the short of it. When I'm using that account to test something else, I need two disjoint accounts. I don't want those to be mingled at all.
Are you going to unfriend me now?
No, you're good, man.
So the other thing,
Yep.
you said in your post-mortem, don't play MMOs. I see you always playing Path of Exile.
Get out of here. Path of Exile isn't an MMO. Shh. God, Path of Exile is so good. The biggest time regret I had about GDC and PAX being this past month in the early April was that there's a Path of Exile league that came out right before GDC, and I just had no time to play it, and so I have not yet. Yeah, no, I mean those games they're traps, right? Anything that you can. So Path of Exile is a little different for me, specifically in that most of my Path of Exile time is spent playing solo. Which means, I can still budget that around whatever time I do have. I don't feel social pressure to play the game at times that interrupt my work. Obviously, you can dump bajillions of hours into Path, and you've seen my profile, so you probably know better than I do right now how many hours I've played it, but it's a bunch. But all of those, for the most part, are time that I can afford to be playing a game and don't.
I'm not going to judge what you do in your free time.
Oh, of course not. I wouldn't expect it. But the reason that MMOs are specifically trappy. So have you spent much time playing MMOs? Like, have you played a lot of WoW
Yes.
or FF14 or any of that stuff?
Yes.
Did you play during Battle for Azeroth?
I haven't played those MMOs specifically.
I'm thinking of Legion. So anyway, that is the last major WoW expansion. Introduced a thing called Mythic Plus, which is endlessly scaling 5-man group dungeon content. So like normally, you have a 5-man dungeon. It's got a set level of difficulty. All the enemies have whatever health and damage and abilities they have, right? And eventually you either outskill it to the point where it's not challenging, or you overgear it to the point where it's not challenging because your character's equipment is too good, right? Mythic Plus kind of turns that concept on its head by having a number of exponentially scaling modifiers to the dungeon, where basically with every single plus rank, health and damage of every enemy goes up by 8% multiplicatively, right? So like if you're on +5, it would be 1.08 to the 5th power instead of just like 1.4. So there's this crazy exponential scaling that means that at some level you need absolutely perfect play and zero mistakes to get through whatever you're doing. Your gear is being pushed to the absolute theoretical maximum. Like one mistake, one bad rotation, and you're one of the DPS to finish the boss, or like one missed heal and you're going to have somebody die, stuff like that. And so you end up with, at the very highest tiers of that Mythic Plus system, you end up with a very small set of people that you can rely on to play with at that level successfully. And so there was heavy societal pressure for me when those friends would be around. So I had a group of friends that I would play with during that expansion. And if they were, if we were sort of struggling to get everybody together, and they happen to be around right in the middle of the workday, there were certainly times where I'd be like, okay, that's fine. I can take a half day here and go play. Uh, and it's, needing to play around other people's schedules that makes MMO play so dangerous. It's that social pressure, right? Like, I can play Path of Exile whenever I want. But if my 4 Mythic Plus friends are around for Darkheart Thicket plus 24 or whatever, then yeah, you got to do it. And that's obviously not good for productivity.
I think the time I stopped playing MMOs was when I started buying games on Steam, and that was only after I moved to the US, because in Pakistan there's actually not any feasible way to pay online.
Really? Is that still true now? Because I know that Valve has spent a lot of time like trying to accept alternate payment methods in
A lot of countries,
lots
yes.
of countries. Yeah.
And then I noticed at one point that 20xx's regional price in Pakistan had dropped to like $7, and I was like, oh, that's neat, but there's still no way to pay that $7. You need an enormous amount of money to have a bank account with that has a credit card where you can make those online payments.
Oh, interesting.
This is a large part of why piracy is so prevalent. People who
Yeah.
even want to pay can't pay.
Yeah, it's just kind of true of piracy in general, right? Like, piracy happens for two major reasons: convenience and money. And there are a lot of people who end up pirating games that buy them later, or who pirate them specifically because there's something difficult about accessing the game through, whatever legitimate way you're supposed to be able to do it. And yeah, for players who literally can't purchase my game because they don't have the systems required to do so, like, that's fine. Just go ahead and pirate it. I don't care. Obviously, if you become able to buy it later, then sure, please do. But if you were never going to be a purchaser anyway because you literally could not be, I would much rather you have fun with my game than not have fun with my game.
That's a very optimistic approach.
Yeah, and the other half of it is that, piracy cannot be beaten, really, not effectively. Like, obviously, every so often there is a version of Denuvo or similar DRM software that, sort of stops people trying to crack games for a while. But the really popular ones almost never end up being beaten long term. And I just, I'm a solo developer who did all of the tech work on a game, shy of some of the porting work. I really don't have time to try and compete with somebody who is an expert at breaking into and, unlocking games. So
You
why
even
try?
you even told people to pirate their game, and if they like it, buy it when asked
Yeah.
about a demo.
Yeah. Was that in my
AMA, it was.
AMA or something? Yeah.
I think
sounds
that
right.
got you a lot of goodwill from me.
Oh, yeah.
So that's when I bought the game. Like around the time of that, after that AMA, when you answered my question.
You're like, huh, that's kind of cool. Oh,
Yeah.
did I answer one of your questions directly before you had bought the game and gotten into it?
Yeah, you did.
That's kind of funny. Woohoo!
So this last month, a new reason formed for why that makes me never want to play another MMO again. I never want to experience the pain one feels when an MMO shuts down.
What MMO did you play that shut down?
Cosmic Break. It was this kind of mecha custom robo type game
Yeah.
with
that sounds
PvP.
cool.
It was honestly very pay to win.
Bummer.
But at the time, I moved on to Cosmic Break when my first MMO shut down. Fusion
gosh.
Fall, it was pretty much like all the Cartoon Network characters in one big MMO, and it was great for my 10-year-old self.
Nice.
And then it shut down, and I was sad, and in order to move on, I got Cosmic Break. Then I got to Steam and bought different games and stopped playing Cosmic Break. Then this year it shut down, and I was sad again, and I never want to experience that again.
Yeah, I think this is maybe me speaking from an MMO privilege standpoint, but I don't think any of the MMOs I've ever really gotten into have actually shut down. I didn't like FF14 the first time it came out, so I wasn't playing it when it shut down or anything. But I'm pretty sure Ultima Online is still being made. Is that right? That might be right. I know that the original EverQuest is still being made. Obviously, World of Warcraft is still.
So my final off-topic question.
Yeah, sure.
One time I submitted a bug report on the Mantis tracker and
Yeah.
about segment in Sky Temple, a side path with a mortar that was shooting, the one segment with the that goes upwards with the moving platforms, and there was at the time a mortar that would shoot at you, and it would be really hard for Ace to actually
Sure.
get in
Yeah, yeah.
there when it was any stronger than an alpha mortar or skulls were on.
Right.
So I was actually flying, and I was in an airport when I was checking my email, and I saw you replied to that bug report. So for the brief moment I had internet, I hop onto Discord, say, "Hey guys, Chris closed this ticket. Tell him why he shouldn't have." And then
Yeah.
and then my plane is there, so I leave, and I later find out that Sour got Sour and a bunch of others I got them to email you basically, and then you responded, got a bunch of emails, will change the ticket, and you removed the mortar. That is,
Yeah.
I think, been my defining moment for the game.
That's your defining moment?
I rallied other players from an airport.
Oh, very good. That's true. Yeah, yeah. That's pretty good.
So yeah, that has been my defining moment.
Well, but it's stuff. It's what you're describing right now is a big. It's a perfect example of the kind of passion that our fans have shown in playing and interacting with the game and its community. Right, like that's awesome. You cared enough to rally fans from an airport, and on the other side of it, I actually changed something in response to that.
And then after I got to Pakistan, I didn't have a laptop that could play 20XX, and I was going through a withdrawal.
Yeah.
So then it took me like a week or two to build a computer.
Right.
And that was a very good update at the time. The undeveloper was just out.
Oh yeah, I remember when we added that. I think we could probably do that a little better in the future too. There's a
Okay,
lot of stuff I could do differently. Yeah, go ahead.
so this has been a very informative interview.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for
So,
having me. I'm more than happy to talk to you about all this stuff.
in in closing, I just have one more question.
Yep.
The topic of my research paper is about player feedback in the game's development process, and I think, at least from me, it seems like where games that do employ that player feedback, it creates a lot of goodwill for the developer, but mainly, yes, that's the one thing. It creates a lot of goodwill. Your players are happy and they will buy your future products, but it also creates a game that I think would have been better than one without it, assuming the game's genre benefits from early access, because, story-driven games and the like.
Yeah, I think all of that's probably right.
Do you agree with my hypothesis?
Well, I sort of jumped the gun there. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way of putting it. There's a trade-off there, right? Opening your game up to early access, if you are able to process and suss out what good feedback is, will help you make a better game. So the two prerequisites. Well, let's go ahead and let's step one further step back. Building on what you just said a moment ago, let's say there are three prerequisites to early access, helping you make a better game. One of them is your game is early access friendly from a genre perspective. Obviously, some narrative games are going to benefit from that, but mostly it's games that people will come back to and return to over and over, like any kind of situation generator or roguelike. A second one is whether or not the developer has time to interact with their community meaningfully. Like, somebody who doesn't put in the time that I did wouldn't get anywhere near as much out of it. And thirdly, the developer has to know what good feedback is. They have to be an effective filter for feedback in order for any of that stuff to matter. But yeah, given that a game meets those criteria, a game that spends a lot of time listening to and implementing fan feedback as best they can is going to end up stronger than a game that skips those periods.
Can you see yourself doing Netflix again in the future?
Yeah, probably. I've already done it once. Why not? I've paid a lot of those costs. It depends on the kind of game, obviously, but if it still fits, yeah, sure.
Do you see yourself reusing your engine?
It's a little too early to tell, and I don't really have anything to share there quite yet. But if the situation called for it, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of work that we've done there. That if we were to make a game in a similar genre or similar vein, that we wouldn't have to make again if we reused the engine. So yeah, I could see us doing that.
Okay, so that was the interview is now officially done. Thank you so much for
Hooray.
this. I look
Oh,
forward to any hot unannounced projects you're working on.
Gotta have those hot unannounced projects. I'm obviously working on something, and we are not sharing what it is yet. But
Though
I'm sure
and
that people
I
will like
also
it.
look forward to the next time you update 20XX.
Yeah, for sure. I know there's some stuff that we still have in the backlog that we need to get to at some point.
By the way, I think the test branch is stable enough to go live.
Yeah, I think it is too. I need to do that at some point soon. That'll be relatively near term, I think. There's really no reason that shouldn't have gone live a while ago.
Yeah. So, good talk. I